G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Welcome to the third video in my little series about Sopwith camels. Warbles on camelology, perhaps. Those of you who've been paying attention to the series and are familiar with the channel will be aware that the first two videos were based on the views of Captain Norman Macmillan, who flew camels in the First World War, ran an airfield training people to fly camels during the First World War, so he knew what he was on about according to the knowledge of the day. And those words, back in the day, are kind of critical to this equation because the people who flew camels back in the day, they flew them intuitively. They weren't sometimes particularly clear or coherent when they were describing what they were doing to fly the camel. And I thought it might be interesting if we could go and have a bit of a look at the kind of ghost written account of this bloke here, because he's the fella who did the test flying in 2017 on this brand new Sopwith Camel. I propose to read the text from Aeroplane Magazine, December 2017 vintage. The words are by Ben Dunnell and the photography is by Darren Harbar. Taming the Little Beast. One First World War pilot called the Sopwith Camel, quote, a little beast, unquote. Now, thanks to the efforts of the Northern Aeroplane Workshops in completing their last project, the Shuttleworth Collection's chief pilot has had the chance to find out for himself. When Dodge Bailey, the Shuttleworth Collection's chief pilot, took Sopwith F1 Camel reproduction D1851/G BZSC into the air for the first time at Old Warden on 18th of May this year, it brought one of the historic aviation scene's most compelling stories to a close. The West Yorkshire-based Northern Aeroplane Workshops, established back in 1973, had already turned out two superb World War I fighter facsimiles for Shuttleworth. Sopwith triplane N6290/GBOCK and Bristol M1C, in inverted commas, C4918/GBWJM. It had been a close, fruitful, and for those involved, memorable association. The NAW had shut up shop when the Camel was moved to Old Warden for completion during the summer of 2013, but the machine's maiden flight marked the very end of that group's final project, one that has set just as high a standard as its predecessors. Eric Barraclough was the mainstay and inspiration behind the NAW. Having worked for Compa, Heston Aircraft, and Oster, he was steeped in aviation. Quote, when the Bristol M1C was coming to completion, we were looking at another project, recalls Robert Richardson, another NAW linchpin. Eric had the idea of building the first Blackburn aircraft, which was an abomination. It really was. None of us were interested in it at all. Then he suddenly turned round and said, I've got some camel drawings in my loft. He seemed to have forgotten them. The first medal was cut when we were still on with the Bristol in December 1995. That was at the Murfield workshop at Butt End Mills. But shortly after that, we moved to the best workshop we ever had at the Skopos Motor Museum in Batley. Once the Bristol was delivered, we started full-time on the Camel. There was always a merge between the various projects, one finishing and one starting. Sadly, Eric Barraclough was only to see the early stages of the Camel build. He died in November 1997, but the standards he had always desired in NAW's projects set the tone. Adherence to the original remained to the fore. We built the fuselage sides first, says Robert. All the sub-assemblies like the wings and fuselage were done in jigs. The experience gained on the Sopwith proved, he comments, quote, very useful indeed. That'll be the Sopwith triplane, the other Sopwith. The construction methods were very similar. In the early days with the triplane, we used to order all our own materials, but eventually we realised that the best thing was to do it through the chief engineer at Shuttleworth because he'd got day-to-day contacts It made it so much easier. Most of the airframe is spruce, but the longerons are ash. We were fortunate right the way through all the projects that we had very capable woodworkers. The last one was a chap called Chris Lawson, who had his own woodworking company in Skipton. He and I set up the wings at Batley. We ordered the streamlined wires from Bruntons, who were making these wires during the First World War. We fortunately had tube left over for the from the triplane for the undercarriage, so we were able to utilise that. It had been specially drawn for us by a firm called T.I. Reynolds in Sheffield. There were other parts coming from all over the place, apart from what we were making in the workshops. John Shaw, the chap in France who's completed one Camel, which, as reported in our news page last month, sadly came to grief during its maiden flight on the 24th of September, and is on a second one, provided the casting for the windscreen and the casting that fits onto the block tube to take the air intake pipes. The front engine bearer needed to be water jet cut, so we took the first one to a local firm. That was quite a big job. One of our members did the second one. Of the metal fittings made in-house, Robert says CAD, computer-aided design, was available, but none of us had the expertise to use it, or CNC, computer numerical control machines, and so on. So we did it the old way. Sopwith would have stamped these fittings out, but we drew them out on a piece of metal, cut them out with a saw, filed them up, and then bent them as appropriate. The engine was Shuttleworth's. All we had was a crankshaft, which we used to set various things up. When we first approached Shuttleworth about the Camel project, the then chief engineer, Chris Morris, told us they had another Clerget. It's turned out to be a 9BF, 140 horsepower, long stroke. So it's more powerful than the one in the triplane, the 130. So you're looking at an extra 12 millimetres in the stroke length. Same RPM, same weight, 400 pounds. They thought they could get that airworthy, which they've been able to do. It took a lot of work. It needed new pistons, new cylinders, and parts of the tappets as well. Shuttleworth's engine specialist Phil Norris is an absolute wizard on rotaries. That's your Clerget 9B. The first two NAW aircraft were done under the CAA auspices, but the Camel was done under the LAA, Light Aircraft Association. That worked out very well. One of the pilots down at Shuttleworth, Rob Millenship, was our LAA inspector. He was very good. He lives in Nottingham, and he'd come up quickly to discuss things. Usually his response was, yes, that's fine. Having proved ideal for so long, conditions in the Batley premises deteriorated when they were sold off. It was horrible in there when it was really cold, but we persisted. Then in 2013, the lease was due for renewal and the Shuttleworth weren't prepared to renew it. It worked out very well in the end. The other side of it was that none of our members were getting any younger. It was always a disappointment that we were never able to attract youngsters. About 6 NAW members were working on the Camel when it left in August 2013. At that point, Robert continues, the undercarriage needed final welding. The cables were in, but they weren't spliced. The systems weren't in, like the air and fuel and oil systems. So all that was done down at Old Warden. That's probably a good thing because they've got to maintain it. I know they've had to put a small access panel on the port side, which isn't authentic, but they weren't able to get to the fuel filter, even going upside down in the cockpit. The big things as far as modern standards were concerned were that a 4-point harness was put in for the pilot rather than a lap strap, and obviously the glue. The old casein glue, or pot glue, that they used in the First World War is not a good idea. So we used Aerodux 500, a very good modern glue. The plywood cockpit and side panels, which proved troublesome, were completed before the airframe was taken down to be covered, using synthetic materials rather than linen. The chosen colour scheme was that of a Ruston Proctor built example operated by No. 70 Squadron Royal Flying Corps, the first frontline unit to receive the type. It carries the serial D1851 and is named I Can Hop It, bracket I Can Hop It. Engine runs began in August 2016, leading up to the following May's successful maiden flight. In preparation for that, Dodge Bailey did a great amount of homework. He used 3-view diagrams of different Sopwith types, all to the same scale on acetate sheets that could be laid over one another to afford the most direct comparison. They depict the Camel, the 1.5 strutter, the pup, the triplane, and the snipe. Amongst other things, they showed that the Camel's tailplane is about 60% of the size of the pup's, and that the fin is smaller too. The tail arm is longer on the triplane, making the tail more effective. They both preceded the Camel. Its snipe successor, meanwhile, saw the tail going back to the sizes of the previous aeroplanes, and the fin and rudder made significantly larger. That tells you a lot about what the aeroplane is probably going to be like, says Dodge. A very simple technique, but quite illuminating. Then there were period scientific and technical papers to read, drawings made by the Germans of a captured camel and reproduced in Flugsport to examine, and numerous references to study. In his weighty tome, Flying Qualities and Flight Testing of the Aeroplane, former CAA test pilot Darrell Stinton described flight testing a Clerget-engined Camel. A May 1968 issue of Flight International includes a piece by 6 Victory Royal Naval Air Service pilot Captain Ronald Sykes on flying a Bentley BR-1 powered example. Best of all, Dodge feels, are the writings of Wing Commander Norman McMillan, who was operational on Royal Flying Corps Royal Air Force Camels on the Western Front and in Italy, and subsequently flew the type while instructing at a fighter school back home in the UK. Apart from several books, Macmillan wrote an article on his camel experiences that some years after his death appeared in the October 1984 Aeroplane Monthly. It was called, quote, A Fierce Little Beast. In that feature, says Dodge, there's some really good advice and counterintuitive advice. For example, to start the takeoff with the stick on the carburetor intake tubes. Because the Camel cockpit is set more forward, the carburetor is closer to the pilot than in earlier types. To start the takeoff with the stick on the intake tubes means the stick is fully forward. It's pretty unusual to do that. On most tail draggers, you would start with the stick back, and some you would start with the stick kind of neutral. What I had to think when I read that was, why on earth is he telling ab initio students to do that? This is one of the bits that I don't understand about the thinking at Sopwith at the time. If we overlay the Camel and the pup in side view, sir, yes sir, I'm not going to chop up the book, so there's a Camel in side view. And there is the Sopwith pup. You can see that the cockpit has moved from the trailing edge to under the centre section. So the distance from the cockpit to the engine has changed. They moved the pilot forward. In the pup, the area under the guns, pretty much where the centre of gravity is where the fuel tank is. Any aircraft designer will tell you to put the fuel tank on the centre of gravity. Then, as the fuel burns, it doesn't change the centre of gravity. Whatever made them move the cockpit forward means that the fuel tank can no longer go there. So it goes behind the cockpit, well aft of the centre of gravity. When the fuel tank is full of fuel, the centre of gravity is a long way aft. That's a clue to why the guy is saying, quote, stick fully forward. It means that when the aeroplane is in flight, it is not in trim. Now, you have to be a bit careful about the term, quote, in trim, unquote, because it means different things to different people. To pilots, in trim means I have trimmed the aeroplane. I can take my hands off and it flies straight. It doesn't pitch up or pitch down. That is, if you like, controls free in trim. To a flight dynamicist, in trim means that the sum of the moments is zero. In other words, that the aeroplane isn't pitching, but the pilot might be holding a huge control deflection and or force to hold it in that condition. If he lets go of the stick, it wouldn't be in trim at all. It would pitch. The Camel is like that. In order to stop the aeroplane pitching, you need a relatively large stick force. What the aeroplane wants to do when you're taking off with a full fuel tank is to pitch up. Imagine that a student used to taking off in an aeroplane with a stick back takes off in a Camel. It's got twice as much power, maybe 3 times as much as he's used to. It's very lightly wing loaded and it'll be airtime in no time. If the stick is back and the aeroplane is out of trim, it will just pitch up as it leaves the ground, and he will just stall and crash straight away. Or not. Your attention is drawn to the blue mantle of unburnt castor oil flowing freely in the slipstream of the Camel. By putting the stick forward, Macmillan knows there is no chance of the pilot putting the aeroplane on its nose because the CG is so far aft. The first thing that happens is that he'll see the tail coming up once the takeoff starts, and then he can adjust the stick position. If he's late, if he holds the stick back and doesn't get it forward early enough, the aeroplane's going to pitch up. It's all about anticipating the reaction of the aeroplane when it gets airborne. You don't actually leave the ground with the stick fully forward. Like I say, as soon as the aeroplane's rolling and the tail comes up, you can move the stick to hold the normal attitude, the normal takeoff attitude for a tail dragger. When you get airborne, you're pushing on the stick all the time to stop the aeroplane from pitching up. These being, of course, a pair of paintings illustrating one of the famous antics of Durban Victor Armstrong. He flew through the gap between 2 camels in a line of them on the ground, and then he looped and went back down through the gap at 150 miles an hour, and everybody saw him do it. I'm told that if you run the aeroplane right out of fuel, like they would have done, by the time it's empty, the centre of gravity has moved pretty much onto the forward limit, and now you're pulling all the time to the point where it became quite difficult to do 3-point landings. The pull force needed to get to that position was quite a lot, and you might run out of elevator before achieving the 3-point attitude. We never fly at that short of fuel, so we've not been there. So the Camel is, if you like, out of trim with any sort of fuel in the tank at all. And under that out of trim condition, it is also unstable. You're dealing with an aeroplane that requires a force to maintain its attitude, but the force changes after a disturbance and will likely be unpredictable. One of the mitigations we came up with was to only use half a tank of fuel. The other thing was that, because this Clerget is a really nice engine, to throttle up relatively steadily. That made the takeoff a little bit more manageable. I really anticipated the aeroplane to be unpleasant in pitch because every bit of evidence suggested that it would be, and it didn't disappoint in that regard. I also expected turns, particularly to the right, to be compromised by the gyroscopic precession. I found on first acquaintance that even left turns were pretty unusual. These were climbing turns because I was climbing out. I continued to climb until 3,000 feet or so and then throttle back. And as soon as the power came back below about 1,000 RPM, the aeroplane started to get a bit more pleasant or less unpleasant. The pitch deficiency is at its worst at high power and pretty much has gone away by the time you're gliding, so you don't really notice it when you're coming into land. One of the things you tuck away in your head is, if it gets too much, throttle back, which might be counterintuitive to some people. What was more of a surprise was how directionally sensitive the aeroplane was. There are very few aeroplanes that I have flown that behave like this. I think the Compass Swift is similar, but not as bad. Most aeroplanes you want to fly in balance, so you put the slip indicator in the centre using the rudder normally. Once you've put the rudder in that place and your feet hold the rudder in that place, things won't change unless you change the power or the speed or the aileron. That's not the case with the Camel. Having put the aeroplane in balance, it doesn't stay that way. It's the directional equivalent of the pitch handling characteristics, in the sense that it will diverge from that condition you thought you had sorted out, and you have to put it right again. Darrell Stinton refers to that as, quote, there is no stability. It's all control. You not only have to control the pitch, which you were kind of expecting, but the yaw as well. What it boils down to is that you have to be actively in the control loop all the time. Reputedly, the only time a Camel will fly hands off in trim is when it's inverted. There you go. That's a painting of a camel flying in trim, hands off. Not actually, but you get the point. I think if you were to fly it enough, you would get to love it. And in one of Macmillan's books, he reckons it's maybe 15 hours on the Camel, and then you've adapted to the aeroplane. I haven't got 15 hours on the Camel. I've probably got 3. So what I've been relating are first impressions of a strange aeroplane. In combat, flown by someone with the requisite experience, Dodge says the Camel, quote, could be manoeuvred in a very unpredictable way, so it would be a very difficult target. Equally, they could get on the tail of a more predictable aeroplane which couldn't manoeuvre anywhere near as aggressively as a Camel. What the Camel couldn't do was go fast. It couldn't run away or chase. It just had to fight, and it did that very well in a tight dogfight. One of the things you notice when you're flying tight turns is that the gyroscopics of the engine start to dominate things. If the aeroplane pitches up, the gyroscopic precession causes it to yaw to the right. When you're turning steeply, as far as the aeroplane is concerned, it's pitching up to go round the turn. If you're making a left turn, the aeroplane is pitching up, so it'll yaw right. To stop it yawing right, you need to apply left rudder. When you enter the turn, you use some left rudder and left stick. Then, having got the bank on, the nose is pitching up, and so that left rudder needs to stay on, and even a little bit more. In a left turn, it does not feel particularly odd. Now, in a right turn, you might need a little bit of right rudder as you start to roll into balance, but as soon as a pitch rate appears, that right rudder is no longer appropriate. Try that again. As soon as a pitch rate appears, that right rudder is no longer appropriate. You need left rudder now. In a steep right turn, if you don't apply left rudder, the nose will yaw down towards the ground. The tightness of the right turn is limited by how much left rudder you can get on. You can end up in a tight right turn, going around apparently on a sixpence, probably only just getting rid of the push force, so you're not pulling particularly, you're just relaxing the push force, with nearly full left rudder on, and the aeroplane is perfectly in balance. That does feel odd. On other Sopwiths, he continues, the gyroscopics are there, but they are less intrusive because the tail volumes are greater. Power is, of course, a factor. This Camel has the 140 horsepower 9BF long stroke Clerget engine. Somewhere in the documentation for that engine, it says you must not use full throttle at sea level. Effectively, it gives you a bit of enhanced performance at altitude that you're not allowed to use low down. Full RPM would be 1,200 to 1,250, and at that setting, with nearly full power on, the aeroplane is at its most cantankerous. But for what we need to do, we don't ever need to apply that amount of power. What I've found is that if we take off with maybe 1,100 RPM and get the climb to display height out of the way, as soon as you're high enough, come back to 1,000 RPM, and then you've got a less challenging aeroplane. It had been hoped to display the Camel at both of the last two Shuttleworth shows of 2017, but conditions were too windy. With all the usual provisos, it should make its public flying debut at a very appropriate occasion, the 2018 season premiere event on Saturday the 6th of May, marking the RAF centenary. There are the fruits of so many labours. The fruits of so many labours will hopefully be airborne for all of us to see, and the exploits of one of the greatest British fighters recalled. When Sir Thomas Sopwith saw the Northern Aeroplane Workshops built reproduction triplane, he thought it so good that he famously declared it, quote, a late production example. Were the great man still alive, he would surely consider just the same to be true of this Camel. So here endeth the Warbles Camelology video number 3. Hope you're enjoying the series. Now that you've had a couple of hours of instruction on some of the subtleties and intricacies of a camel, you'll be in a better position to fully appreciate it when we get into the next video, where I'll introduce you to the doings of Durban Victor Armstrong, Captain Durban Victor Armstrong, who, apart from inventing night fighting in a camel, this was his party piece. Rolling his own personal Sopwith Camel, painted bright red, at ground level. And you can tell how serious this young fellow was about his aerobatics, because not only has he got an air compressor here, which has been moved. Normally they're on the rear cabane strut. He's also got another one down here. And the theory is that he may have set his Camel up with a full inverted fuel system. Funny bloke, the Urban Victor Armstrong. The fellow who reckoned that he could fly his way out of trouble. But his Camel got him in the end. And this book goes a very long way towards explaining what happened and why. So, hope you're enjoying it. I'll see you in the next episode. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.